This is the last demonstration in this module about camera systems. All of you will be working differently. Some of you may watch all the demos because you're undecided which brand you want to film on, and others of you will be already using a camera for stills, or you might have even started with video, so you know what camera brand you want to use. I'm taking this last presentation because at the end I'll go into a little bit more detail about the lens choice or the choices I make. So whatever systems you decide to use, the decision on what lenses to use and when is actually a separate matter. So as I'm a Canon educator, I'm talking about Canon cameras for filming. Now, Canon does have an array of cinema cameras, in other words, video cameras, but these are quite pricey, so I'm focusing on the systems I use. Now, I moved over from video cameras about 7 years ago. I used to use video cameras in my role as a video journalist at the BBC. And when I went into wedding filmmaking using these cameras, there were a few advantages for me at the time as a beginning wedding videographer. And these included the fact that there was one zoom lens with a lot of capability for zooming, and I didn't like the idea of chopping and changing lenses at the time. I could also record audio into the cameras from the radio mics, which I could also monitor, and this was really, really important to me. But there were some disadvantages too. It was a cumbersome camera and I felt intrusive at weddings, and also its movie quality was just 720p. So I moved over to a DSLR, and I actually filmed my first wedding on a DSLR with our little family camera, which was just a 700D. Have a little look at this film and I think you might be impressed with the look, even though this was a cheap DSLR with a kit lens. You might also be able to spot the times when my locked off camera was actually the Sony Z1 video cameras, as I used those during ceremony and speeches. There's the clue. Now, please bear in mind, this film is very old, over 6 years old in fact, so please don't judge me.
Now you will feel no storms, for each of you will be shelter to the other. Now you will feel no cold, for each of you will be warmth to the other. Now there is no loneliness, for each of you is companion to the other. You are two persons, but there is one life before you and one home.
Oh, I know where I wanna be.
Turn together to look at the road you travelled to reach this, the hour of your happiness. It stretches behind you into the past. Look to the future that lies ahead. A long and winding, adventure-filled road whose every turn means discovery.
And it's just like a dream.
New hopes, new joys, new laughter, and a few shared tears.
Like a song we sing in harmony.
May happiness be your companion. May beauty surround you both in the journey ahead and through all the years to come.
For you and me.
Go, this day, to your dwelling place and enter into your days together. May your days be good and long upon the earth. Your adventure has just begun.
I'm reminded when you walk through the door.
I'm not one for tradition, but I'm going to follow one tradition and start it off by saying, on behalf of my gorgeous new wife and I, I'd like to welcome everyone who's made such a fantastic effort to be here.
Oh, I know that you're all I need. Maybe one day we'll have a family.
Wow, that's it then. Ollie, my little brother, is now a married man. Firstly, can I just sidetrack very briefly and reflect for a moment on this amazing day? Congratulations first to everyone that was involved in getting this going. We all know how hard you worked, and the fact that it looked seamless and it was flawless shows that you guys nailed it, so congratulations.
And in recognition
I'll stay
of our shared life
same
together.
spot by the fire.
Wear it with feelings
of love and joy.
of love and joy always. I've already made one promise today, quite an important one, and I make one more, which is that I'll put Kizzy's happiness before mine every single day.
Oh, I know where I wanna be.
But really, I didn't need a booklet to tell me how lucky I am to have married Kizzy. I'm sure you'll all agree she looks absolutely stunning.
And I know that's the way you feel about me. And it's
Seeing Kiz walk down the aisle today was the proudest moment of my life. I don't know what I've done to be so lucky, but I'm certainly not going to complain. Every day's been a mini adventure, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life finding out what adventures are around the corner. So could you all stand as I propose my final toast? To my brilliant, to my beautiful, to my gorgeous wife, to Kizzy.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, I've obviously improved a billion-fold since then, but I just wanted to show you how that little 700D coped. So I was also learning all new settings here on the DSLR. Instead of gain, it was ISO. Instead of exposure, it was aperture. And I also didn't have the ability for zebras and peaking, so I had to manually work out if all my shots were exposed nicely or indeed in focus. Now, I think, to be honest, some of my footage was a little hot at first, but then I worked with a lot of photographers with a light and airy editorial style, so I think I got away with it. Now, for this demo, I'm going to be talking about the Canon 5D Mark IV and the mirrorless camera, the Canon EOS R. Not the new Canon R5, nor the R6, although what I'm going to tell you in terms of setting up your camera will still relate to those cameras if you're investing. But it will also relate to a lot of other Canons. I know many videographers using 7D and an 80D, and they're all perfectly nice for entry-level filming. So before we go into the setting up of your Canon EOS R, I'm going to do a quick comparison of the 5D Mark IV and the EOS R, which I love. So let's talk about money first. The EOS R body is actually cheaper than the 5D Mark IV, which is regarded as a camera for professionals. But the EOS R needs an RF lens mount. So if you want to use your EF lenses, you'll need to buy this adapter. But it's still cheaper than the 5D Mark IV. The EOS R is a mirrorless camera, so it's smaller and more compact than the 5D Mark IV. There's only 8 pounds in it, but of course the 5D IV is bulkier. I find for my corporate work the EOS R easier to shoot on for long periods of time, as I'm often running around hotels or filming cable cars and gondolas in the mountains. So this camera, being lighter, is much easier for me. What about build quality? Well, both cameras are made of the same durable material and both are very durable. But the flip out screen on the EOS R does mean it's a little less forgiving, and if folded out gives more opportunities for it to break. Of course, you can fold it back in again. So let's talk about the LCD screen in a little bit more detail. Both are touch screens, and the 5D Mark IV is a teeny bit bigger, but the fact that the EOS R has a flip out screen is really awesome and opens up more scope for getting yourself into tricky positions when filming. Low positions are much easier. For example, you can often find me lying on the floor during portrait sessions with a 5D Mark IV, but now with the EOS R you won't, thankfully. So looking at it in more detail, when using the 5D4 at sunny destination weddings, which is what I film most of, I've always used this Zacuto lens, and this cuts out the light so I can see the LCD display better. But obviously, while I can use this on my 5D Mark IV, I can't use it on the EOS R because of the flip out screen. So instead on the EOS R, I can put my eye to the eyepiece and use that. And that's pretty neat because it automatically swaps from viewing on the LCD to viewing in the viewfinder. So you can put your eye close up to it and cut out the light. So that's pretty cool. Now, both cameras can use the same batteries, which is really good when you're using a combination of both cameras. I also use the 5D Mark III as well. Now, those that have done testing say that the 5D Mark IV lasts a little longer than the EOS R. I can't say I've really noticed. I just work with what I've got, and I tend to use branded batteries, so I always know how much juice is left. There's no surprises, unlike when you use a fake battery, they can often go from 2 bars to 0 in a moment, so it's not really ideal, especially during ceremony and speeches. Both of these cameras have very similar menus, and I find them really easy to use. The EOS R camera has a more simplified buttons menu, and it's also added a great new touch bar which you can customize it to any function you like, so you could make it ISO, white balance, or even autofocus mode. So this new touch bar is really super. Both cameras absolutely nail the dual pixel autofocus system with facial tracking and FlexiZone. With the new firmware update on the EOS R, there's also eye tracking, which is insanely accurate. And since both cameras are touchscreen, you can drag on the focus as well. More on that later. The main difference with the two cameras is focus and peaking. So with the EOS R, for all the manual focus users out there, you can now see what part of the shot is visibly in focus. Now, Canon has been way behind the competition with this, so it's really great that they've introduced it, and I'll be talking about it in more detail in the next section. Both cameras have very similar, if not identical, specs on resolution and frame rates, in other words, movie quality. Both can shoot up to 120 frames per second at 720p, 50 frames per second at 1080, or 25 frames per second at 4K. But in 4K, they both have the 1.74 times crop factor, so your 24 to 70 lens becomes something like a 40 to 120. More about that as well in a little while. In terms of colour depth, I'm not really about to get all technical here with bit rates, but suffice to say that the EOS R has a better colour depth, which basically means you can capture twice as much colour information, which allows you to push and pull the colours further in post-production. And with dynamic range, as before, I'm not getting technical about that either, but the EOS R is better for shadows and details than the 5D Mark IV. If you want to shoot in C-Log, the EOS R has this option built in, but with the 5D Mark IV cameras, they need to be shipped off to Canon to have it upgraded. Again, more on C-Log when we dive into settings shortly. So, for all you handheld nutters out there who probably have much bigger muscles than I do, the EOS R comes with a digital image stabilizer that works pretty well. It will slightly crop your image, and if you're into a lot of handheld shooting, this feature will be a huge plus for you. Now, I'm not. My style is to frame up a shot on a steady pod, commit to the shot and film the action as it unfolds rather than chase the action. In my main wedding videographer course, I'll go into much more detail about this, and I'll touch on it later in this module and course when I talk about my storytelling ethos. So what about memory card options? Well, I prefer to use CF cards. It's just a personal preference, but the EOS R only has one slot and it's for an SD card. The 5D Mark IV has dual slots for both SD and CF cards, but unfortunately you can't dual record in video. That's only for stills. In low light, the EOS R outperforms the 5D Mark IV and preserves the detail in the shadows and in the highlights. There's just much less noise. Here's a film I shot at night on the EOS R with a 50 prime RF lens. Now, I just couldn't have done this with the 5D Mark IV, and I was really, really impressed.
Heute Abend wird das erste Teil von der ersten Sektion der neuen Gondelbahn hier von Zweileutschinen bis an die Destination Grindelwald-Grundbrach. Das Das Ganze dauert etwa 5 Stunden. Die Schwierigkeit ist hier, dass wir verschiedene Brücken zum Überqueren haben, wo das ganze Gewicht nicht aufnehmen können. Die ganze Last zusammen hat 100 Tonnen. Es ist auf 2 Lastwagen verteilt, wo die Seile je zur Hälfte ausgelagert ist. Und die Schwierigkeit ist einfach, dass man immer mit dem ersten Lastwagen über die Brücke fährt und die Seile so vorspannt und dann mit dem zweiten hinten nachkommt.
And finally, in terms of image quality, there's not a lot between the two, but I do think the EOS R has the edge over the 5D Mark IV. Just a quick side note on lenses before we get set up, and I'll be using the EOS R for the demo. The EOS R introduces us to a brand new line of lenses, the RF lenses. As yet, I haven't bought one, but as I said above, I have used one and I was pretty impressed, but it was heavy and bulky. They'll cost you more than the camera itself, but they do have a control ring on them and the option to add an ND filter adapter, so that's pretty cool. The EOS R can take both the RF and the EF lenses, but the 5D Mark IV can only take the EF lenses. Right, now it's time to get set up with your video. So let's start with the settings which I've always known to be the back end of the camera, everything from movie quality, picture style and sound, and then we'll move forward to the front end step by step to focus. Resolution and movie quality can be set in the menu, so let's begin with that. Here are the options open to you. Now I usually film in 4HD 1080 in 25 frames per second. The Alli codec is the highest quality but takes a lot of memory, with IPB less information, so smaller file sizes. Now if you're going to be working in C-Log or flat picture profile, I recommend All-I. If you think you want to slow-mo any footage, you can also do that on 50 frames per second and it's still full HD, which is great. Now let's go back and I'll show you how to make the changes with ease, because if you press the info button here until you can see all this information on the back of the camera, use the Q button in the middle of the camera to change the settings. This is also where you can change to 4K, but don't forget about that crop. Now let's look at picture style and Canon log. Let's look at picture profile first, because this is the first step into filming here, and if you're not comfortable with color grading, then you won't want to film in log. So let's look at the camera then. If you come over here and click on picture style, as you can see there are many built-in options. A lot of videographers use faithful, and that's a nice flat profile. If you want to keep it simple, just turn this on. As before, you can make all these changes right from here on this part of the camera. Now, I actually use neutral, and I've input the following settings to create a picture profile called Pro Lost. As you can see, the sharpness is right down, as is the contrast. So again, a pretty flat profile. Now it means what I'm seeing in the LCD display is what I'm recording, and I'm very comfortable with that. And when you start out filming, I highly recommend you don't run before you can walk, and use a picture style that means you're happy with the look of the footage in the back of the camera without grading. Now let's look at filming on log. Just briefly, if you aren't familiar what log footage is, it's a very desaturated, low contrast image. The image is going to look pretty grey, but the benefit of shooting in that is when it comes time to colour grading, it gives you some more flexibility with dynamic range, so you can get more details in the shadows and in the highlights. So overall, it helps create a better looking image. But as you can see, it's quite hard to see what the image looks like on the back of the camera. So even before you get into post, it's trickier to master. But the Canon EOS R has view assist, which is super helpful as it puts on a temporary LUT. So when you're filming on this screen, you still have some contrast so you can see what your image might look like. So for stabilization, the camera doesn't have IBIS, so it doesn't have internal stabilization. So this is the camera's digital version of this. If you enable it, it crops a little bit, and if it's enhanced, it crops even more. So only use this if you're handheld. Now onto the sound settings, which you can access from the main menu or from the back of the camera as you're about to record. Now, as you can see, I have my audio recording set to manual. I've just set it to a few notches down from the dead center, and in the next module, when I go into sound in more depth, we'll pop on and off camera mic. But essentially, if you're recording audio automatically, the camera will always be looking for sound. So for instance, in a quiet room, the camera enhances the dead sound, and in the edit, you'll hear an annoying hiss. So that's why I always film with my sound on manual. I look at white balance then. The camera's auto white balance is pretty good, and there's also options to choose here like daylight, cloudy day, tungsten lights, etc. And you can also change it manually, of course, by changing the Kelvin. When I'm lining up multiple cameras for ceremony and speeches, I'll make sure the Kelvins match depending on where the camera placement. So moving forward and onto exposure and whether you should film in auto, AV or manual. I usually film in manual, but if I'm moving from one place to another with different light exposures, and I'm doing this quickly, I might flick into AV, so I'm not messing about with exposure. Capturing the image is more important to me than messing around with the settings. So, of course, in AV, I can still ensure the f-stop is nice and low for a shallow depth of field. When in manual, of course, the lower the f-stop, the more shallow the depth of field, and for most of the day, I'm filming at 2.8. But when I'm filming ceremony and speeches, I'll actually be at about 4 stops and maybe above a bit, and that's to make sure that more is in focus. Now, I go into these preferences in a lot more depth in my full wedding videographer courses. Now, my shutter speed is going to be double my frame rate. So if I'm filming 25 frames per second, then my shutter speed will be 50. And if I'm filming 50 frames per second, then 100 shutter speed. As I said a moment ago, I like to have my aperture as low as possible. So I've bought a couple of ND filters to assist with that for when I'm filming sunny locations. As with working in AV, when moving from location to location, and I've also been known to crank up the shutter speed if I don't have time to pop on an ND filter. And I actually filmed many weddings without any filters and the footage looked fine, but I still would always recommend that your shutter speed is double your frame rate. Okay, finally, now on to focus. Let's start with autofocus. I really only use the 2 of these here. Firstly, let's look at facial recognition, set up by pressing here. And you can enable the eye detection here too, switching on and off like this. The eye recognition and face detection on this camera is brilliant. In fact, I'm using it now for this presentation. I use it for all my online courses, like now, and I also think it's really important for tracking shots of the bride and groom, walking back down the aisle, confetti shots and portraits. It's really great. The other I use in video is on-point focus, where you can track the focus using your fingers on the LCD display, just like this. Cool, right? Now, as I mentioned before, you can flick into manual on the lens and use the focus peaking, so you can now see what part of your shot is visibly in focus if you want to work in manual. So flick into manual on the lens and then you can see the icons here. Touch the area you want to have in focus, adjust the focus wheel on your lens and bingo! You can see when you're spot on and you've nailed it. A few other quick settings to note: the movie servo for autofocus definitely needs to be enabled. and for the movie Servo autofocus settings. Basically, this just adjusts the sensitivity of the autofocus. So I want my autofocus to be very quick and snappy, so I bumped up the sensitivity on this so the camera is faster to go into focus.